Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 30th, 2009. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, Jason Perkins, head brewer of Allagash Brewing, joins us to tell us about his experience with spontaneous, wild, or natural fermentation. Whatever you want to call it, letting the wild organisms that are floating around in the air have their way with your beer is an intimidating proposition. But the folks at Allagash are following the ways of the Belgian brewers at their brewery in Maine. We'll ask Jason how it's going. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook. My username there is Basic Brewing James. We also have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video page on Facebook. And if you become a fan of the show there, I'll be sending out occasional notices when shows are posted and such like that. The 2009 logbooks are still in stock. Get yours while you can. You can check them out on basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us bring you this show, and we appreciate your support. I've bottled my little extract wheat beer that I'm using for the Basic Brewing Radio Brew Your Own Magazine collaborative experiment. I did notice a couple of differences between the beer that had spent 4 weeks on the primary yeast and the beer that had spent half that time in the primary and half in the secondary, but I'm not going to tell you any more. I don't want to influence your results if you're taking part in the experiment, and I don't want to give it all away before we record a show on the results. And, my perceptions may be off the mark, so I want to get other people involved as well. Just another reminder, the PDF form that you can use to track your experiment in what happens if you leave the beer on the primary yeast for an additional 2 weeks is at basicbrewing.com/experiment. The online form that you can use to report your results is also on basicbrewing.com/experiment. Coming up this weekend is the American Homebrewers Association Big Brew. That's coming up on Saturday, May 2nd. You can find out about how you can get involved at beertown.org. That's the Brewers Association and AHA website. And you don't have to just be American to do the Big Brew. You can do it anywhere in the world. And by the way, if you want to join the AHA, there is now a banner ad on basicbrewing.com for the AHA. And if you join through the link, you'll be helping to support both the AHA and us. And we appreciate that. Let's go to the mailbag. Christopher from Kingston, Pennsylvania writes, I'm going to participate in the Big Brew Day this weekend. I think that this would be the best time to make the jump to all grain. However, I have kettle volume issues. Could I split the 6 gallons that I get after the mash and boil them in 2 separate pots and then combine them back when I place them into the primary? I would assume that I could add the hops to both pots without too much worry about them being the same in both pots, since I will be adding both pots to one primary. Well, yeah, Christopher, I think that would work. The big thing with all grain is that you have to boil for the full length of time to coagulate the proteins and volatilize the DMS precursors, etc. But I don't see why you wouldn't be okay in splitting an all grain wort and boiling the 2 halves separately and then recombining at the end. Now, some may say that there may be some little differences in hop utilization in the varying volumes, and especially if they're if you've got, say, first runnings in one and second runnings in another, but there's probably not enough to worry about or even detect. So let me know how that comes out. Following last week's Brewing on a Budget show, Jeff from Jamberoo, New South Wales, Australia, writes with this. Jeff says, I have a variation on the brew more, brew with a friend, and reuse yeast suggestions. I have an arrangement with a brewing mate whereby we both brew double batches. We choose different styles. For example, he recently brewed a wit beer, while I brewed a Dunkelweizen. We both use the no-chill method, decanting the wort into large HDPE plastic containers. We call them cubes here in Australia. Then we exchange 1 cube each. So we get twice the beer for the same effort and get variety to boot. And to keep the Skinflints theme going, we exchange fresh yeast slurry to provide ready-to-go starters. Well, that's awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And Jeff suggests I do a show on the no-chill method, and I think that's a great idea. In fact, it's on my list of things to do. Someone from a past show, Darren Goad, who you heard on our APA experiment show, wrote in. Darren, you may remember, was the one that I was teasing because he wouldn't make a starter because he didn't have the proper equipment. Darren says, well, I was tired of you making fun of me on your podcast, so I decided to make my first starter by cultivating yeast from a Bell's Two-Hearted Ale. I even did it without a stir plate. Don't worry, the stir plate is on its way. Well, good, Darren. We want you to be happy. Continuing to experiment with our beers, Darren says, Jim and I made a 10-gallon batch of a Two-Hearted Ale clone recipe and split up the yeast again. We used the cultivated yeast for 2.5 gallons and California ale yeast for the rest. I made 3 starters for this batch because we wanted to be sure to pitch the correct amounts compared to the usual smack and pour method. After a very successful Sunday brew day, thanks to the new brewer's logbooks, little plug there, we oxygenated with Jim's new oxygenator, pitched our starters, and then took them to the basement. Darren says, I got home from work on Monday, walked down to the basement, and was hit by a very strong smell of beer. The pictures tell the rest. And he sent some pictures along that are described by this list. Darren says, my firsts for this brew day, number 1, cultivated yeast from a bottle. Number 2, made starters without a stir plate. Number 3, oxygenated prior to fermentation. Number 4, had a bucket explode in my basement. Number 5, had to clean krausen off the walls of my basement. And number 6, had to make my first blow-off tubes so it didn't happen again. So Darren says, you failed to mention the exploding part when you suggested I do a starter. Well, boy, when you guys make a starter, you make a starter. I told Darren that the part that I was most amazed at was the fact that they had harvested yeast from a Two-Hearted Ale. I was under the impression that was a filtered beer and you couldn't do that, but I guess I was wrong. I guess I'm too busy slurping down the Two-Hearted Ale when I get my hands on one. Too busy doing that, enjoying the beer, rather than checking the bottom of the bottle. But maybe I'll slow down next time and check. We have to drive like an hour to get the Two-Hearted, and boy, it's good stuff. Hope the beers come out well, despite the explosions. I appreciate the story and the pictures, Darren. Quite a mess, by the way. Thank goodness it was in the basement instead of like the living room or the kitchen. Okay, over the years, every now and then I get an email asking about whether spontaneous fermentation is doable in the U.S. The Belgians do it. They just open the louvers of their fermentation spaces and let the bugs that are naturally in the air inoculate their lambic worts. The result is wonderfully funky stuff. But common knowledge had it that Belgium was the only place on Earth where that technique would work successfully. But the guys at Allagash decided to put that to the test. Well, Jason Perkins, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Give us some background, first of all, on your involvement with Allagash.
Oh, my involvement goes back almost to the beginning of the company. I've been here for about 11 years. The company's been around about, this will be our 14th year. I had some experience in 2 other small breweries before I came on board here with Allagash, but when I started there was 3 employees, including myself, and so I've seen it really grow from a small brewery when most people, even craft beer drinkers, had no idea what a Belgian style beer was, and were asking us why our beer was cloudy and why it smelled the way it did and so on, and we were just making a few hundred barrels a year, and so I've kind of watched it grow and grown along with it, and now we're making more beer and have more employees and have certainly a better reputation than we once did.
Well, congratulations.
Thanks.
I got interested in, or had an idea to interview you guys because I heard heard Rob Todd on Craft Beer Radio in their Philly Beer Week coverage talking about spontaneous fermentation and lambics, and I emailed Rob, and he said to talk to you. So he passed the buck. So it's
yeah, that was nice of him.
Well, hopefully this will be fun.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, is what you're making, is it a lambic, or is it something like in the champagne where you can only call sparkling wine that's made in the Champagne region champagne?
Yeah, that's kind of the way we feel. We feel that, truthfully, we try to avoid the use of lambic, although it has been used and documented, us using that word, but not intentional, really. I mean, we kind of feel like that word should be reserved to the folks over there in Brussels area in the Seine Valley who have been making that style of beer for a long time. We tend to refer to it here as a spontaneous fermentation beer, yet to be named. But we try to avoid the use of lambic where we can.
And are any of these beers out on the market yet?
No, they aren't, and I don't honestly foresee them being out on the market for at least another year. Would be my best guess. I mean, when we started doing this, we really didn't know what we were going to have for a time frame, and we thought that we could go loosely based on the time frame that the brewers who are producing true lambic are doing. But we're doing it in a different part of the world. We're doing it with a different setup than a lot of those places. So it was really hard for us to tell, and we won't release any of that beer until we feel like it's ready to be released and tasting the way we want it to be. And it's interesting now, but it's young.
Now, young is, I guess, a relative term because you brewed the first batch in late 2007, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we've brewed 6 batches now total. We brewed 2 in the late fall of '07, and then 2 more, I believe, in the in the spring of '08, and then again in the fall of '08. We chose not to brew any this spring, mostly because we don't have any room. We don't have any room to put the barrels, to be honest. So we're going to wait and see what happens with these batches and how they develop. But all along, the idea was that most likely, whatever it is we release would likely be a blend of different vintages, if you will, of different years.
And that's kind of the traditional way to do these styles of beers.
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it certainly is. And we have really started to see that, the reasons for that, not only in blending of different vintages, but also the blending of barrel to barrel, because it's just really remarkable differences in character from the same batch from barrel to barrel. And we foresee when we do release these beers that blending is going to play an enormously important role in how that beer really comes out. And that's really going to be a challenge for us and a fun challenge for us to blend to the proportion that we want. And in the process, there may even be a few barrels that don't even get used, as sad as that sounds. But that we'll judge based solely on flavor.
Yeah, I guess you're doing the old style method before they knew what was doing the fermentation in the beer, and when it worked, God is good, and when it didn't,
yes,
it didn't.
Certainly.
So the common knowledge is that you can only do spontaneous fermentation successfully in one region of Belgium. Where did you guys, get the chutzpah to try it in Maine?
Well, it was actually a couple of things. One, in talking to some of the brewers over there who are making lambic style beers, despite what's been printed throughout history about lambic beers, they kind of feel like these beers can be made in other places, and they think that, and they're very interested to hear how successful people are in other parts of the world. Which was a little bit of a surprise to us when we first started working on the project and started talking to some of the brewers across the pond, and we weren't sure how they would react, but the reaction we got was, we really want to know if you can do it where you are. So it was something we wanted to try from that perspective. But another thing that really pushed us in the right way was we discovered in our brewery about 6 years ago the presence of a new strain of Brettanomyces that actually infected some of our beer in the brewery unintentionally, and we really liked the character of whatever it was. We didn't know what it was at the time. It definitely seemed to have some Brettanomyces character to it, and we're a small brewery. We don't have the lab capabilities to be able to truthfully figure out if it was Brettanomyces. So we utilized a commercial lab to help us with that and isolated the strain and found out, in fact, it was a Brettanomyces strain that they had never seen before. And we now use that in a number of different beers here in the brewery, both small-scale stuff and some stuff we even sell regularly. So just the presence of that in our environment around here really gave us a lot of confidence that there was some stuff in the air around here that could do what we wanted to do. I mean, as you probably know, a huge part of the character of the traditional lambics, it comes from several organisms, but Brettanomyces is a really big part of what they do. So we figured if we had that in the air around here, there's a chance we had some other stuff, but to say that we were very confident and would not be telling the truth, because we definitely took a pretty big chance, and I definitely have commended Rob as the owner of the company here in taking that risk, because for us to really do it correctly, or the way we wanted to do it, and to use a traditional coolship, we couldn't really do much experimentation, because a big part of the fermentation or the inoculation of this wort needs to take place in this room, and the only way we could really experiment with that is to build the room. So once we built the room and had the coolship, we might as well start to make big batches. So it was definitely a chance we took. But those were the two big things, I think, talking to some brewers across the pond and discovering some already resident microflora around here. Those are the two things, I think, that really gave us the confidence to give it a try. And
I tweeted out there on Twitter, asked for questions, and beer merchants over in the UK, they're really interested in what you guys are doing. He asked a bunch of questions, but one of the questions he asked was, have you seen the terroir from your local area? And I guess the answer is yes, if you discover it.
I would say the answer is most definitely yes. That Brettanomyces alone is like I said, a very unique strain that had not been seen before. And for those who are familiar with our beers that regularly get made with it, the Allagash Interlude, and we have a new beer that we just released called Allagash Confluence. Those two use a good chunk of Brettanomyces for the fermentation. And you get some of the classic barnyardy flavors that are traditionally known to be associated with Brett strains. But you also get a lot of really ripe fruit and sweet tart type flavors that aren't as typically associated with Brett strains. So it's definitely a unique character, and we feel, I would say, immensely lucky that we discovered it. It was really just one of these strokes of luck that it came along, and for a brief period of time when it infected one of our beers, it was a bit of a panic, but in the end, it was just a blessing for us to get that.
So you are using that strain in other commercial beers that we can get a hold of?
We are, yeah. We like I said, we have a commercial lab who banks it for us. They isolate it for us, and they bank it for us, and then whenever we want to use it, we will, depending on the usage, we will get a quantity of the Brettanomyces from them. We also have it resident in many of our barrels here that we use for various other small-scale, one-off barrel aging beers, and so there's Brett in a lot of those barrels as well.
Now, Beer Bear asked, what areas of the country are best suited for spontaneous fermentation, and do the plants in the area have an effect?
That's a question I don't really know the answer to be honest. The one thing we did with our preliminary research is we looked at weather patterns and looked at temperatures in our area versus the areas that we knew had success with producing spontaneous beers, namely, obviously, the Brussels area. And the temperature profiles were very similar for the majority of the year. The big difference is, here in Maine, we get very cold winters. Most of our January and February and even March are below freezing every day. That's not the case in the Brussels area. and Brussels brewers will brew spontaneous beers throughout the winter because their temperatures don't drop that much. We chose not to because of our hard freezes that we get around here. And then the other difference would be the heat of the summer. July and August gets pretty warm around here, and whereas Brussels stays a little bit on the cooler side. Brussels brewers still choose not to brew in those summer months because of the type of microflora that's present in warmer days. But those periods in the spring and the fall that we focused on brewing in, if you look at, we pulled up some charts of weather patterns in the Brussels area and then weather patterns here, and the graphs are identical during those periods. So we thought that would help. I think that temperature plays a large role. I think that if you lived in a very, very wet environment that got a lot of rain, my guess is you would might not be the best ideal climate for that in terms of what kind of microflora would be present in a wetter environment. Beyond that, that's about all I can say. I mean, I think that experimentation is really the only thing that can really dictate that. I mean, once again, going back to brewers who are brewing in the Seine Valley, historically they talked about the cherry trees that were around there, but anybody who's been to that area now knows that there's not many around there anymore, if any, and those brewers are still very successful. So I think plants must play a role, and environment must play a role, but to what degree, I think, is something that's just going to have to be determined over time.
So did you guys choose the times of year that you chose because of the temperature and the effect that it would have on the wort as it was cooling and as it was being inoculated, or were you looking at the presence of the bugs in the air?
We did choose our brewing schedule based on temperature. We wanted to do it at a time, and this is also some of this stems from conversations we've had with these brewers across the pond in terms of when the best time to do it is. And it seems to be that you want it to be a little on the colder side, if we're talking Fahrenheit, in the 40-degree range, because you get some activity of microflora, but you don't get a lot of these, a lot of the bacteria that likes it at a little higher temperatures, stuff like Acetobacter, which creates vinegar. Those kind of microorganisms we've wanted to try to avoid. So the temperature played a large role for sure.
Now let's get into the process, if you don't mind. And there's a video out on YouTube. If you search YouTube for Allagash Lambic, I believe, is what I used to find the video. But it's a nice little video. It shows the process of you guys doing the first brew session of this beer and the cool ship, which I want to get into the description of. But go out to YouTube, and after you've listened to this, of course, and and take a look at that. But let's get a definition. Really, spontaneous fermentation is really a misnomer in kind of the same way that the old theory of spontaneous generation in the old days, where they thought that maggots just magically appeared out of rotting meat, right?
Sure.
I mean, you can't have spontaneous fermentation. The fermentation has to come from somewhere, right?
That's absolutely true. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, it's a word a phrase that's been around a long time, but you're absolutely correct. It's not completely accurate. But what it's known to be, when it's used to describe a process where, for many years, in modern brewing techniques, all beer is fermented by adding a cultured, very specific strain, one strain that you selected. Maybe you have a brew, you add a couple too, but you're selecting those specifically. In the case of spontaneous fermentation, you're relying exclusively on natural airborne microflora that are present in wherever it is that you set your wort. For us, we choose to use the traditional use of a cool ship. So there is obviously, the bugs are there. They're just not added manually. They're added just naturally, if you will. So a natural fermentation might be more accurate way to say it, but or wild fermentation, something like that. But that basically is what it refers to.
Now, what is a cool ship? A
cool ship is a traditional vessel that originally brought about by Belgian brewers. It comes about from many years ago when traditional cooling methods that are used today had not been created yet. In terms of more mechanical means of cooling your wort and then adding yeast. So they had to have some way of getting the wort created in the brew house down to a temperature where yeast could start working on it. Obviously, no yeast, no matter whether they're in the air or in a pitching tank, can handle 200 degrees Fahrenheit wort. So some way to cool that wort down, and a cool ship was used to do that, and is still used by spontaneous fermentation brewers. It's basically a very shallow pan. We sometimes call it a big brownie pan because it looks like a big. You could make the world's biggest brownie in it. Very shallow. Ours is about 10 inches deep and holds about 15 barrels of wort. So it's wide and shallow, creates a lot of surface area for the microflora that you hope is in your area to have contact with the wort. Being shallow, it also allows for more rapid cooling as opposed to a large upright tank wouldn't cool as quickly.
Now, I spent 12 years working for a major food company, and one of my jobs was to write. I created the food safety section of their website, and in there it says, there's a danger zone between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. You've got to keep your food out of that danger zone, because it'll get contaminated, and there's stuff in there that'll kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes against that. And one of the questions that I've been asked several times is, why doesn't spontaneously fermented beer, why don't we have to worry about it hurting people? Or do we have to worry about it hurting people?
No, I mean, the basic answer to that really is the presence during fermentation. Alcohol is obviously created, and pH drops of your liquid substantially. The combination of those two things, predominantly alcohol content and pH, there has been numerous studies done on pathogens in beer, and no pathogens have ever been able to grow in the presence of alcohol and pH levels that are in beer. So we're talking, once the fermentation is done of this product, we're talking about 5% or so alcohol and about 4.0 pH. So no pathogens have been able to live in the presence of that type of environment, and that's the case for breweries anywhere, and it's a nice thing working with beer because we're not making milk and we're not making chicken and stuff like that. We do have the ability to have that in our repertoire, if you will.
So is there a way that you can do it wrong in order to create pathogenic organisms? Like, for instance, I've heard that the brewers down in Australia, the home brewers, are cooling they're using a no-chill method where they put their wort into a sealed container and chill it overnight, let it cool naturally overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a danger, and you may not know this, but is there a danger that by depriving the wort of oxygen that other organisms can survive, that before the fermentation takes place, is there any way that we can screw this up?
I think there could be, yeah. I think that I don't know for sure, to be honest. I think it's something that people, if brewers out there want to be experimenting with spontaneous fermentation, they should be careful, certainly, because and that's the case with any new technique that people haven't done before. I mean, you always have to be cautious when you're trying something new. The only thing I can think of is that pathogens certainly could live in the presence of wort. There's nothing keeping them from living in wort. So if your fermentation doesn't happen in a timely fashion, you're giving pathogens opportunity to live. Now, once fermentation happens and pH drops and alcohol rises, those pathogens can't live anymore. But that's not to say that they can't live in early on in fermentation. So getting fermentation is very important. and creating the alcohol and creating the pH drops are important factors.
This is why it's important, if you're going to save wort for starters, say that you need to actually follow canning instructions.
Yes, absolutely.
To get a safe product that you can store.
Yeah, I mean it's good for a safe product. It's also good if you're going to then use that wort to grow up yeast culture for a subsequent brew. You want to know that there's nothing in there until you put your yeast in there.
So, one question from Kieran in Dublin: do you use the same equipment that you with these spontaneously fermented beers, or do you risk contamination with your other beers?
Well, we haven't done a lot with this particular beer in terms of putting it through our equipment, but when we have, like emptying the cool ship and putting into barrels, we have an entirely separate set of hoses and gaskets and fittings that are used only for our cool ship generated beers. And in the case of bottling them, we would do the same. We have a small hand bottler that we will probably use exclusively for these beers, and we've got a fair amount of experience with handling things differently like that, because the spontaneous beer series is not the first time we've dabbled in wild fermentations here. We've got, as we talked about previously, some Brettanomyces beers and some other beers with Brettanomyces and Lactobacillus and other organisms that we've done in the past, intentionally adding in those cases. And we have a completely different procedure for handling that beer in the brewery in terms of different hoses, different gaskets, different pumps, and so on, because you can't be too careful. As many people probably know, 95% of the beer that leaves our brewery is not supposed to be wild, so we want to keep it that way. And Brettanomyces especially is a very, very vigorous little bug that will consume anything you give it and can tolerate alcohols up above 20%. So yeah, we do need to be quite careful with the way we handle these beers.
So let's talk about the recipe that you guys have been using, and you talk about it a little bit in the YouTube video. But are there any differences in the ingredients for these spontaneously or naturally fermented beers that are different from a standard beer?
Yeah, with these at least the first batches we've done here in the cool ship, we chose to kind of follow what has traditionally been done with the lambic style beers, and that is to use a real heavy portion of raw wheat, so unmalted wheat, and then Pilsner malt in addition to that. We also do a pretty vigorous turbid mash schedule, which basically it's a decoction mash, several steps, which involves really beating up the grain quite a bit. Not something you would traditionally do, or not something you would do in modern brewing. Something that's very much discouraged. And a lot of that procedure is done to create a wort that's really able to sustain a 2 to 3 year fermentation by various microorganisms. It gives a lot of long-term nutrition. The normal sugars will be consumed in the first week or so, but the more complex sugars and proteins provide nutrition for the long haul for these other microflora that are present throughout the long fermentation. And then the other big thing would be hop usage. And once again, we chose to follow what has traditionally been done with these lambic-style beers, and that is to use aged hops. Basically, all we're looking from the hops in this case is their preservative qualities. The oils of the hops have a preservative quality that help to keep certain microorganisms at bay. In this case, Lactobacillus is not necessarily a microorganism we want to be the most dominant characteristic in alambic. So, and Lactobacillus is not a big fan of these hop oils. So we add a large portion of very low alpha acid hops, which basically means that very little bittering potential to these hops, and that's caused by the long-term aging of these hops. So I think those are the two big things that are different: the turbid mash and the use of raw wheat, and the use of aged hops that set our brews aside from the rest of the beers we do here. That being said, there's you look at a brewery like Cantillon, and they certainly make lambic beer using that type of mash schedule and those type of ingredients. But they have some others as well that they're doing not using the traditional raw wheat style. So I think that there's opportunity out there to make spontaneous beer and not necessarily follow that traditional lambic recipe, if you will.
So talk about how the fermentation progresses. What do you see through the fermentation process?
We see in the first, it varied a little bit depending on the brew, which one of these 6 brews we did. But in the first week, we see fermentation kick in. And all this fermentation takes place in barrels in our case. So it comes out of the cool ship into a quick mixing tank to homogenize basically the solution and get any inoculation that happened at the surface of the cool ship to be mixed. And then the barrels are immediately filled from there. So all the fermentation takes place in these barrels. So when I say in the first week fermentation takes place, that's when things get pretty messy, and there's a lot of activity out of the top of the bunghole and the top of the barrel, and that sustains itself for about a week and a half, where you can really actually physically see active fermentation taking place. And then what we've seen from there is the mellowing out from there, and I would say, once again, this is all based on flavor analysis, that somewhere around 80% of the total sugars have been consumed during that first 2 to 3 week period. And then from there is when some of the other character starts taking place. We started seeing some Brettanomyces type character about 6 or 8 months in. So it's pretty phenolic, pretty plasticky, if you will, early on, and after the initial fermentation is done, and for the first 6 months or so. And then it took, I would say, once again, depending very much on the barrel and on the batch, somewhere about a year before any sign of real acidity and tartness started to kick in. And that's kind of where we're at now. Some of the earlier batches are showing some light acidity and light tartness, and then some of the later ones are not.
Barlow Brewing from Charlottesville, Virginia asks, are you seeing differences in the performance of the Maine bugs versus the Belgian ones that you could purchase? So are you seeing a difference in the characters of the beers as they evolve over what you would get if you tried it with Belgian strains?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. At this point, hard to really describe differences, but these beers that are in our barrels are nothing like anything we've ever produced here, and we've done a number of experiments with other strains, and we've even done some barrel fermentations using some commercially available so-called lambic blends that some of the commercial yeast suppliers are selling, and they're very good. They're very good beers, but what we're producing using the cool ship so far is a remarkably different flavor. So yes, I would say completely different. You've got
to be patient, because at some point, did you smell and taste things in these beers where you had your doubts about this whole process?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there's still some barrels that we have our doubts on, for sure. But we can't give up on them. And we've seen this with other beers, not produced in the cool ship, that it's just when you think you're going to count one of these barrels out, it does something to surprise you. So we have to be patient, and we have to wait and see how things develop. But if I were to guess, there'll be a few barrels that will probably end up in a drain, most likely. But maybe not. As soon as I say that, they'll probably surprise me.
I've tasted some pretty funky beers out there, and
yeah,
there may be a taste buds for in some of these beers that you don't like. So it'd be hard to rule something out that you've worked so long and hard on.
Yeah, absolutely, and we probably would honestly never do it, because we've really been surprised in just a 2 or 3 week period of time going back to a barrel that previously tasted one way. It just tasted completely different. So we're just going to have to keep playing that by ear.
So have you, beer merchants asked another question, have you seen any unforeseen bonuses or problems with the fermentation, and have you maintained your original grist and mash schedule? So have you learned things along the way that you've used to modify your process?
Yeah, we certainly have. The grist has pretty much stayed the same. Maybe some slight changes in amount of certain malts used. Just for example, the first couple batches we were nervous we'd overfill our cool ship because we didn't know exactly how big it was. So we've slightly upped volume in general, subsequently upped malt content. We've ratcheted back our hop usage a little bit. We initially found we used quite a bit of hops in the beginning and found no real hop-type bitterness, but almost like a metallic-y flavor that I think came from just an enormous amount of vegetative material that we were adding. Even though the alpha acids were low and the amount of the bittering potential was low, you're still throwing a lot of vegetative material into your boil. So we've pulled that back a little bit, and we've taken care to make sure that the days that we choose to brew these batches that we keep a sharp eye on weather, because we don't want it to be too cold or too hot outside. So we've tried to keep a little bit of a better eye on that. We would like our fermentations to kick in within the first several days in the barrel for some of the reasons we've discussed previously. And I think weather, at least in our case, proves to have a lot of influence on that.
How long do you have to expose the beer in the cool ship to get good inoculation?
We are just doing it in about 12 to 18 hours, just overnight.
Wow.
So and a lot of that has been based on the temperature of the wort. We want to send the wort back into our building and into the barrels at about 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So depending on the temperature outside and inside the cool ship room, there's some play involved there. So on a real cold night, we might move it into the building a little earlier. So
that's around 15 to 18 degrees Celsius.
That's correct. Yes, thank you.
I get letters.
Yeah, no, I have that information in my little chart in front of me. I could have done that too, but thank you.
And you're not going to add fruit to these, or are you?
We may. We may. I think there's a very good chance that we will. A lot of that will be based on how these flavors develop. I think that all along it was our intention to do that in some way. What fruit that'll be is yet to be determined. I think once it'll be determined slightly on the flavor profile of these beers, but also, we would like it to be local fruit. So that limits us a little bit, but we have obviously some great raspberry growers in our area, and we have some limited availability of some tart cherries. That's not a common crop in our area, but there is a limited amount of them here. And those are the two that I think we would target to start with.
At the end of the video, what do you say? No blueberry?
Yeah, we were asked that several times, and Maine, living in Maine, blueberry everything, and I love blueberries, don't get me wrong, but we probably won't do a blueberry lambic, although our friends at Cantillon have done one that is quite good, so who knows?
Never say never.
Yeah.
Well, what tips can you give us if we want to try this at home? What tips can you give us to give us a successful experience?
That is a tough question. I think honestly, it's just something you need to experiment with in your area on a small scale and see what happens and be careful moving forward with it. And that's about all I can say. It's a tough thing to do traditionally. I would also advise to folks who really like the style and maybe don't have the gumption and the patience to do it to talk to the folks at places like Y East and White Labs, who are two pretty commonly used American yeast producers, and they do have some great blends. I know it's not the same thing, but that's certainly something that's probably a little bit more applicable to a small scale system at home. And you can add these bugs based on a schedule that research has proven is the way that lambics are made. So you add one type of strain early and another one late, and another one even later, and try to get the character that way. Mm-hmm. But as far as doing it to the traditional way, I think that's just up to someone with some patience and experimentation, and I would advise just to be careful moving forward with that.
It sounds like a good excuse to brew a small batch.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
One last question from Twitter. Free on Wheels asks, how do you avoid getting a crusty pellicle inside the bottle?
I think that's a good question. I mean, we'll see, but my feeling is pellicles are formed in the presence of a large quantity of microorganisms. Brettanomyces will form it, and so will several others. And we have seen that formation in our barrels, both on spontaneous beers and on other scale beers that we've done. My feeling is when we package, we would either rely on a lot of settling and over time in the barrel, or we would utilize filtration to remove the bulk of the wild yeast. We wouldn't remove them all, nor could we probably, unless we sterile filtration, but that's not something we like to do. So we would remove the bulk of the yeast, and I don't think a pellicle can form without, like I said, a lot of cells. Mm-hmm. And at that point, when we're ready to package, there's not going to be a lot of growth potential in that beer for bugs to develop because of the presence of alcohol, and the nutrients by that point are going to be really depleted through the long fermentation.
And you're not going to have an infusion of oxygen as you would through wood.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, this has been fun and intriguing, and I admire you guys' enthusiasm and guts in doing this.
Well, thank you.
And listen, I encourage listeners to go to the archives of Craft Beer Radio and listen to Rob talk about how the building was built and how the cool ship was installed, because it's there's a funny story there.
Yes, it was, and that was quite an adventure. The whole thing has really been a fun project.
Well, good luck, and
thank you.
And maybe we'll talk to you again when you actually get the product out and we get an update on the whole process.
We would do that for sure.
Thanks, Jason.
Okay.
Well, thanks again to Jason. I'll try to put a link to that YouTube video in the description of this episode on basicbrewing.com, and I may also put it on the Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing video page on Facebook, too. Fun stuff. I hope that we get to taste some of those beers one of these days. Remember, we've got the Brewer's Logbook and our new Basic Winemaking Introduction to Wine Kits DVD out there on our online store. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. You can check out our other DVDs as well, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, and Stepping into All Grain, where we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. We got combo deals and a listing of the fine folks across our country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. We got shirts, and also thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Canon EF 70 to 200 millimeter f4 LIS USM lens for Canon digital SLR cameras, which is apparently a very nice lens. I appreciate your sending that through our link. Very helpful. And Toe Jam and Earl 3, Mission to Earth. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we appreciate your support. Also, we have associate links to the American Homebrewers Association and Brew Your Own magazine as well. So we appreciate everybody doing everything to support our efforts. Appreciate it. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dotson, who turned, well, I'm not going to say how old he is. His birthday was this week. Happy birthday, Kelly. He won't hear this, but, you know, if you ever run into him, tell him happy birthday. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.